Today's episode, ISO and what is it? So what is it? Film speed is the measure of a photographic film's sensitivity to light, determined by the sensitometry and measured by the various numerical scales, the most recent being the ISO system. Holy cow, half those words I don't even know what they mean. So what's the English version? ISO or film speed simply just means your camera's sensitivity to light. So what does ISO do? Well, like shutter speed and aperture, ISO has an effect on an image when you change it. If you increase the ISO, the brighter your pictures become, because your camera sensor is more sensitive to light. The smaller the ISO, the darker your images will be, because your camera sensor is not as sensitive. A generally good spot to keep your ISO when shooting is between 100 to 400 as a low ISO, but that's just my opinion. Pros and cons. If you're outside shooting when the sun happens to be setting and you're in a shaded area, you might see something spectacular that you just don't want to miss. However, your camera's saying your shutter speed is too low to handhold. Well, whatever will you do? So you can increase your camera's ISO so you'll be able to have a faster shutter speed. This is what most ISO is used for, just bumping it up so you can have a faster shutter speed. The negative about ISO is the more you increase it, the noisier or grainier your pictures may become. But wait, I don't want grainier pictures. It's a whole long story that had to do with film originally, and it now has to do with the pixels becoming bigger to allow more light in, blah blah blah. No one really wants to know all that. So how do we avoid grain or noise in our photos? First, if you don't want grain or noise in your photos, shoot at a lower ISO. Does this mean that your camera can never be shot at, say, ISO 1000? No, of course not. You certainly can, because a little noise is a quick fix in post. Okay, review time. So we know the ISO increases the light sensitivity of our camera. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive. The lower the ISO, the less sensitive. Pretty simple. Generally, a good ISO range to stay in is 100 to 400. Any more than that, I would say use a tripod. That doesn't mean that you can't go over ISO 400. Most important, the higher the ISO, it can cause grain or noise in a photo. But we can still shoot at higher ISOs because it's a quick touch up in post. I would generally say don't go over ISO 1000, but again, that's just my opinion. If you have to go to a high ISO for whatever situation you're shooting in to get the shot, as long as you get the shot, that's usually what the most important is. So don't fret or worry about all your ISO settings and all that kind of good stuff. So now on to some examples. Are some examples. Now these were shot with a Canon 5D Mark III, which has very good ISO performance. So if you're shooting at, say, 4000 ISO, the picture isn't very grainy. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that these photos are taken with a camera that's supposed to perform well with high ISOs. Now if I shot these using my Canon 60D, it's a different story. If I shot it at, say, 1600 ISO, you could notice grain much sooner. Now I imported these photos of just some quick things. There wasn't any light on these photos. They were pretty dark, and so as you can see in the corner right over here, it was at ISO 400 at f8 at 1.3 seconds, and this was on a tripod, but it's not the greatest. Now if we zoom into this photo, it's not the sharpest, but it looks pretty good. You can see little pixels. I don't know if you can tell, but it looks fairly well. You know, you could use this photo, edit it a little bit, bam, it's good to go. Now if we move up to the next photo, this was at ISO 1000 f8 at 0.4 seconds on a tripod. If we zoom in, you can start to see a little more grain, but it still looks pretty good. So we'll go to the next photo. Now this one was at ISO 4000 at 1/10 of a second, still at f8 on a tripod. And when looking at the photo generally overall, it looks pretty good focused on this orange. But if we zoom in, you can start to see a little more grain. I don't know how well this will show up in the recording on YouTube, but you can see a little more pixels and the grain starting to come out. Now if we go to an even higher ISO, ISO 10,000 at 1/25 of a second, you can start to see a little bit of grain in the photo zoomed out. Now if we zoom in, you can really start to see all the grain of little pixels letting in more light. If we decide to go even higher, just for fun, this is at ISO 25,600 at a 60th of a second, which I would probably never ever use. And as you can see, it's very pixelated and super grainy and just looks terrible. And then just for over example, this is at ISO 102,400 at 125th of a second, and it looks absolutely horrible. I don't think anyone would ever use this ISO unless they saw someone walking down the street that was a celebrity and had to get the picture. I don't know. But you'd never use this, of course. Now, that's not to say that you wouldn't use necessarily ISO 25,000. Now, looking at the picture like this, as you can see, the higher the ISO, the more grain. So I generally recommend to shoot, I always shoot usually at ISO 100. The 5D can go down to ISO 50. Most usually have ISO 100 or 200 as the lowest, so I'd say stick to that and try not to go over 400, but if you do, I would recommend capping out at about 1,000 as far as for post-production. So this photo looks really good. You can touch up the noise a little bit if you want at ISO 400, but let's say we're using this photo and we have to have it, it's at ISO 25,000. Well, in Lightroom, just a quick fix, you can go down here to noise reduction and it'll just kind of smooth out all the pictures, but of course we want some detail, so bring some detail back into the picture and it looks pretty good. Now if you zoom in, you can still see there's some noise and that the picture doesn't look too good. So you can back off the detail just a little bit, kind of smooth it out, but that's if we needed this to say be a usable picture that doesn't look too bad. But at lower ISOs, like right here is 4,000. With noise reduction, if you smooth it out and add some detail, it looks pretty good. It's not going to be the greatest, but it's definitely usable for, say, a print or something. So remember that when you increase your ISO, your camera is going to be more sensitive to picking up noise and that kind of thing, and no one wants to end up with a photo that is super noisy or grainy, like say this. So if you ever see your photo and you're shooting on automatic and your photo comes out like this because you're shooting maybe in a lower light situation and you don't know why it's like that, that's because your camera automatically upped your ISO. And so, stick to lower ISOs and you shouldn't have as much grain problem. And so I hope this helps and that you enjoyed this quick little part 3 for ISO. And stay tuned for the next episode when we will combine shutter speed, aperture, and ISO all into one so you can shoot in manual mode. Thanks.